Forget the triumphant legends, the bronze statues, the romance of endless seas and noble adventures. If you came here for a heroic saga about the valiant English knight, Sir Francis Drake, I regret to disappoint you, or perhaps to enlighten you. Because beneath the shining facade of a national hero, beyond the aura of a circumnavigator and vanquisher of the Spanish Armada, lay a figure whose hands were steeped in something far more foul than mere Spanish gold. They were covered in blood. And not just the blood of enemy soldiers fallen in fair combat. The most shocking, most paradoxical fact about the great buccaneer isn't his audacious raids on Spanish galleons or cunning circumvention of impregnable fortresses. It's his involvement in the most inhumane trade of the era, the slave trade. Indeed, England's golden age, so cherished by romantic historians, was built upon a foundation paved with human suffering and despair. Drake was not merely an observer or an accidental participant in this vile enterprise. He was an active, cold-blooded participant, one of those who charted the first bloody routes of the transatlantic slave trade. His earliest, and arguably most profitable, expeditions were dedicated to the abduction and sale of Africans in the New World. These were not feats, but meticulously planned, ruthless operations to seize living cargo whose fate was predetermined. Lifelong slavery in foreign lands. Imagine the horror, the despair, the pain of thousands of souls torn from their homes, whose lives became mere stepping stones to his glory and fabulous wealth. It was on this bloody foundation, on the bones of the innocent, that he began to build his reputation and fortune. A paradoxical, cynical basis for a future national idol. England, of course, called him a privateer, a pleasant-sounding, almost aristocratic term for legalized plunder, for state-sanctioned piracy cloaked in high politics and the protection of crown interests. Daring adventurer, defender of the Protestant faith, scourge of the Spanish fleet. These were the epithets showered upon him by Elizabeth Thirst, who skillfully exploited his ruthless grip and complete lack of moral constraints. But for Spain, for the inhabitants of ravaged cities, for the crews of sunken ships, for families whose lives were shattered by his raids, Francis Drake was no hero. He was the embodiment of pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't just seize gold. He burned ports to the ground, plundered churches, desecrated holy sites, and killed indiscriminately, from soldiers to civilians, leaving a trail of ash, despair, and unquenchable hatred. His raids from the Caribbean to the Pacific shores were not merely acts of retribution or reconnaissance. They were acts of ostentatious, cold-blooded cruelty, designed not only to enrich the crown, but also to undermine the very foundation of Spanish power, to sow panic and terror in the hearts of the colonists. He was a tool, but a tool so sharp and merciless that it's impossible to separate his personal lust for gain and power from state interests. In him, the calculating businessman, the ruthless predator, and the loyal servant of the crown merged, a cocktail capable of justifying any atrocity in the name of national prosperity and the grandeur of an empire just beginning to spread its wings. But what forces shaped this dual, truly terrifying nature? What winds were destined to fill the sails of this man, transforming him from a destitute boy barely making ends meet into one of the wealthiest and most ruthless adventurers of his time? What compelled him to choose a path strewn with gold and blood, and what lay behind that cold, calculating gaze that saw people merely as means to an end? We have already peered into the sinister abyss of his deeds, outlining the contours of a figure forged from blood, gold, and imperial ambitions. But to truly understand the monster, or hero, if you prefer, one must examine the seeds from which he grew. For even the most notorious pirate is not born in a storm-tossed sea with a cutlass in his teeth. He is forged in the crucible of circumstances, where poverty, humiliation, and fanatical ideas fuse into something truly explosive. Imagine the scene. Not a cradle, but a rotten, dilapidated barge hull, beached somewhere in the Plymouth estuary. Not a cozy home, but a decrepit vessel that became a refuge for the Drake family, fleeing religious persecution. It was here, amidst the smell of rotting wood, salty wind, and constant dampness, that young Francis took his first breaths. His father, John Drake, a former farmer and now a fanatical Protestant preacher, didn't just deliver sermons. He ingrained in his son's mind ideas about England's divine destiny, the curse of papal Rome, and the eternal, sacred struggle against Catholic Spain. Every day was saturated with tales of martyrs, heresy, and the necessity of cleansing the world with fire and sword. In this atmosphere of religious ecstasy and everyday destitution, where every piece of bread was hard-won and every glance from a neighbor could be full of contempt for refugees, a character was formed, hardened in the fire of hardship and ideological obsession. Poverty, humiliation, the stigma of an outcast and a refugee. This was not just a backdrop. It was the foundation upon which an unyielding will was forged, a desire for revenge, for proving his worth to a world that had rejected him. It was in this dirty, yet seething cauldron that young Francis found his path. He was fortunate, or unfortunate, depending on one's perspective, to fall under the wing of his cousin, John Hawkins. A man whose name today evokes a shudder, but then, in the mid-16th century, it signified enterprise and progress. Hawkins was not merely a sailor. He was a pioneer, one of the first and most successful English slave traders, charting bloody routes across the Atlantic. Not on the deck of a treasure-laden galleon, but on a ship packed with human cargo, Drake learned the rudiments of seamanship. He learned navigation, combat tactics, the art of evading traps, and far more importantly, the art of surviving and prospering in a world where human life was valued precisely as much as someone was willing to pay for it. And so, just when life seemed to be settling, when Drake was no longer merely a cabin boy but an experienced navigator, that pivotal moment arrived. The wound that never healed, transforming the young man into a ruthless predator. The year was 1568. San Juan de Ulua, Gulf of Mexico. Hawkins' squadron, including Drake, was engaged in their usual business, selling slaves. The Spanish, under the command of the Viceroy of New Spain, under the guise of peaceful negotiations, treacherously attacked the anchored English ships. It was not just a battle. It was a massacre. The losses were horrific. Of Hawkins' 6 ships, only 2, including the one Drake was on, miraculously managed to escape, virtually without crew or supplies, wounded and humiliated. The remnants of the fleet, among them Francis Drake, returned to England, not just with empty holds, but with a deep, unhealing wound in their souls. This was not merely a defeat, it was a betrayal, a personal insult. And at that moment Francis Drake likely swore that his life would become one endless act of vengeance. Vengeance for himself, for England, for the desecrated honor of the Protestant faith. From that point on, his adventurism acquired a new, sinister dimension. He became merciless, calculating, and utterly unprincipled in achieving his goals. He saw how easily agreements crumbled, how thin the line between ally and enemy was, and how quickly nobility turned into weakness. The lesson was learned forever. Trust only yourself, and the best way to protect your interests is to strike first, leaving no stone unturned. This very thirst for vengeance, coupled with an innate talent for seamanship and incredible audacity, set him on a path strewn with gold, blood, and legends. A path that would soon lead him to the most grandiose and unprecedented schemes in maritime history, where each victory was merely a stepping stone to the next, even bolder challenge to fate. The seed of revenge, sown at San Juan de Ulua, sprouted not just hatred, but a predatory, calculating pragmatism. Francis Drake, having survived betrayal and narrowly escaped death, understood one simple truth. To truly wound Spain, one needed to strike not at its heart, but at its purse. And that purse was bottomless, filled with gold and silver extracted from the veins of the New World. His first major venture, a harbinger of future grand plunders, targeted the artery of the Spanish Empire, the Isthmus of Panama. In 1572, with 3 small ships and a handful of desperate cutthroats, Drake set his sights on Nombre de Dios, a city that was not just a port, but a transshipment hub for all the treasures flowing from Peru and Mexico. The plan: strike at the very heart of their logistics. Capture the city by surprise before the Spanish could react, and seize the royal treasury. Audacity bordering on madness, but Drake never played by the rules. He knew that fear was the best ally. Under the cover of a rainy July night, Drake landed with his men. The initial assault on Nombre de Dios was almost successful. The streets were empty. Treasures seemed to be laid out on a platter. But at the most critical moment, when the chest of gold was within reach, Drake was betrayed not by an enemy, but by his own body. A bullet, or fragment, fired from a Spanish sentry's musket, pierced his leg. The pain was unbearable. But even worse was the signal it sent to the crew. Their invincible leader was wounded. Superstitions gripped the pirates, forcing them to retreat, carrying the injured Drake. It seemed like a failure. But Drake would not have been Drake if he had succumbed to defeat. The wound only ignited his fury and inventiveness. Retreating into the jungle, he didn't just lick his wounds. He reconfigured his strategy. It was then that he forged an alliance that would forever change his tactics. With the Cimarrons, escaped African slaves who hated the Spanish no less than Drake himself. These people, knowing the jungle like the back of their hand, became his eyes and ears. They told him about the Silver Trail, an overland route by which mules transported silver from Potosi to Nombre de Dios. Under the jungle's cover, Drake transformed into a predator stalking his prey. His men, guided by the Cimarrons, carried out daring raids on mule trains laden with silver. On one occasion, they managed to capture a caravan of 192 mules, each carrying 300 pounds of silver. It was so much that they couldn't carry it all. They buried a portion, taking only what they could transport to their ships. The spoils were colossal, but more importantly, Drake proved that Spain was vulnerable not only at sea but on land. He returned to England with unheard-of wealth, further solidifying his reputation as the terror of Spain and a favorite of the Queen. But this was merely a prelude. The true apotheosis of his audacity and cynicism occurred in 1577. Under the guise of a regular trading expedition to Egypt, and with the blessing of Elizabeth I herself, Drake embarked on a voyage that would forever etch his name into history, and onto the list of the world's most wanted criminals. His flagship, the Pelican, was later renamed the Golden Hind, a ship that became a symbol of unprecedented daring and bloody triumph. The circumnavigation of the Golden Hind, an odyssey of greed. The plan was a secret mission known only to a select few: navigate through the Strait of Magellan, enter the Pacific Ocean, which the Spanish considered their private lake and thus left unguarded, and plunder their defenseless settlements and ships, to return to England by circumnavigating the globe, thereby avoiding the Spanish fleet in the Atlantic. It was a grandiose scheme, demanding not only masterful seamanship, but also an iron will. The execution was hellish. Storms in the Atlantic then, after passing the Strait of Magellan, even more ferocious gales that scattered his small flotilla. Of the 5 ships that set sail, only 2 reached the Pacific, and ultimately, only the Golden Hind remained. Along this arduous journey, Drake proved himself not only a brilliant navigator, but also a ruthless tyrant. The execution of Thomas Doughty. Even before the Golden Hind reached the Pacific, Drake faced an internal threat. Thomas Doughty, one of his officers, and possibly a former friend, was accused of mutiny, witchcraft, and conspiracy against the captain. The exact reasons remain debated: envy, insubordination, or perhaps Doughty simply knew too much about the secret plans of the Queen and Drake. The plan was to suppress any dissent, eliminate a potential rival, and send an unambiguous signal to the entire crew. Aboard the Golden Hind, there was only one will: that of Francis Drake. Drake orchestrated a show trial on San Julian Island, the very place where Magellan had once executed his own mutineers. It was a farce, a theatrical spectacle. Doughty was found guilty, despite his protests and the lack of convincing evidence. In a startling turn, Doughty himself, realizing the inevitability of his fate, requested a final supper with Drake, and they reportedly drank to each other's health, like old friends, before Doughty ascended the scaffold. This was an act of cold, calculated cruelty, a performance designed to chill the blood of anyone who dared to question his absolute will. The consequences. Doughty's execution eliminated the threat, but it also revealed Drake's true face, a man capable of any atrocity to maintain power and achieve his objectives. His authority became absolute, founded on fear and unquestioning obedience. Pacific Campaign, a golden reign. After the Strait of Magellan, with his sole remaining ship, Drake began his plundering spree. The Pacific Ocean, which the Spanish considered their private lake, turned into a personal nightmare for them. No one expected Englishmen from this direction. The plan, systematic plunder of undefended ports and ships, seized the maximum possible amount of gold, silver, and jewels. Execution. Valparaiso, Callao, cities that had never seen enemy sails, were sacked with ruthless efficiency. Drake didn't just take gold. He destroyed Spanish fortifications, burned ships, and sowed panic. His reputation preceded him, and the Spanish, stunned by his appearance, often abandoned everything and fled. The capture of the Yahopi, Cacafuego, or Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. This was the apex of his piratical career. Drake learned that a Spanish galleon laden with untold treasures was moving along the coast. The plan? Track down and capture the richest ship in the Spanish fleet. Execution. The Golden Hind pursued the Cacafuego for several days, using deceptive maneuvers, pretending to be an ordinary merchant vessel. When they finally caught up, the battle was brief. The Spanish, not expecting an attack in these waters, were caught off guard. In an unexpected turn, what Drake discovered aboard the Cacafuego surpassed all his wildest expectations. It was not just a galleon, but a floating treasury, the living embodiment of all the greed and might of the Spanish Empire. 26 tons of silver, 80 pounds of gold, 13 chests of silver reals, jewels, pearls, emeralds. The value of the loot was staggering. By some estimates, it amounted to up to half of the English crown's annual income. The captain of the Spanish galleon, Pascual de Andagoya, was so shocked that according to legend, he exclaimed, "Señor Drake, you have taken my Cacafuego, and I can only say that you are a true devil." The consequences. Drake became not just wealthy, he became a legend. He brought so much gold and silver back to England that Queen Elizabeth I personally came aboard the Golden Hind in Plymouth to receive her share and knight him. This triumph was not just Drake's personal success. It was a defiant challenge to Spain, an act of state-sponsored terrorism disguised as privateering. He brought not only gold, but also the seeds of future wars, sown in the fertile soil of royal greed and imperial ambitions. Drake's return was a triumph, but also an ominous foreboding. He was at the peak of his power, absolutely convinced of his impunity, of his divine mission. His cold-bloodedness bordered on inhumanity, his greed knew no bounds, and his luck seemed endless. But behind every audacious raid, every triumph, every drop of Spanish gold flowing into the English treasury, there were shadows. Shadows of those who pulled the strings, directed the deadly blades, and whose ambitions extended far beyond mere pirate spoils. The question remains: who exactly stood behind this madness, and what price would England ultimately pay for it? The previous segment left us with Drake basking in the golden glow of royal favor, his Golden Hind laden with trophies, and a new knighthood, a symbol of English defiance. But this was merely a facade. Behind the curtain of triumph lay a far more complex, sinister mechanism. Drake was merely the tip of the spear, a tool in the hands of those who pulled the strings in the highest offices of London. Sir Francis's true patrons and allies were not just a group of financiers. They were a shadow cabinet that transformed piracy into an instrument of state policy, legalizing plunder on an unprecedented scale. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was not merely a beneficiary of his raids. She was their chief architect, the puppeteer who, with cynical calculation, used Drake and others like him to undermine Spain's power, not only economically but geopolitically. Her court, full of intrigues and ambitions, was a breeding ground for this new, aggressive doctrine. Sir Francis Walsingham, her formidable spy master, whose networks entangled all of Europe, not only gathered intelligence on the movements of Spanish galleons, but quite likely oversaw operations that ensured Drake's accidental encounters with rich caravans. Lord Burghley, the Queen's treasurer, perhaps reluctantly, but nevertheless signed orders for the financing of these trading expeditions, fully aware that the matter concerned not spices, but the silver of Potosi. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the Queen's favorite, also had his interests in this bloody business, seeing it as a path to strengthening England's influence and, of course, his own prosperity. Their motives? Not solely the lust for gold, though that was undoubtedly a powerful incentive. It was a religious war, a Protestant challenge to Catholic hegemony. It was a struggle for naval supremacy, for England's right to dictate terms in the Atlantic. Privateering became an elegant euphemism for state terrorism, allowing England to plunder without declaring open war, while maintaining the illusion of some legitimacy. It was a game played on the edge, where the rules were set as they went along, and Elizabeth herself was the chief arbiter. However, every medal has a reverse side. If Drake was a national hero for England, for Spain, he was the embodiment of the devil, El Draque, the dragon, whose name was whispered with terror from Cadiz to Lima. And of course, there were those who desperately tried to stop him. Drake's primary antagonist in the New World, especially after his penetration into the Pacific, was the powerful viceroy of Peru, Francisco de Toledo. This man, dubbed the Great Organizer, was the epitome of Spanish imperial order, a figure who ruled the colonies with an iron fist, suppressed revolts, and built a complex administrative system. The news that an English pirate had entered the Spanish Lake, the Pacific Ocean, where Spain felt completely secure, became a personal insult and an existential threat to him. He immediately ordered the outfitting of a fleet to capture Drake, mobilizing all available resources. But the Golden Hind was too swift and elusive. The despair of Toledo and his admirals, such as Alonso de Sotomayor, who fruitlessly pursued Drake along the coasts of Chile and Peru, was almost palpable. Their ships were slow, their intelligence outdated, and their adversary unprecedentedly audacious and fortunate. Beyond official figures, there were others who craved Drake's blood. Captain Pascual de Andagoya, whose ship the Cacafuego was stripped bare, became a symbol of the Spanish fleet's humiliation. His career was ruined, his honor stained. One can imagine his fatal obsession with revenge, his attempts to rally supporters, his letters to Madrid, full of fury and demands for retribution. Perhaps among those who lost everything because of Drake, from merchant guilds to ordinary families whose savings were on stolen galleons, their own conspiracies and plans for vengeance festered, unrecorded in official chronicles, but fueling the atmosphere of universal hatred for El Draque. Even some former friends or partners whom Drake might have betrayed or abandoned, recall Doughty's execution, could have become his secret enemies, awaiting their moment. Thus, Drake's universe was far broader than just his ship and crew. It was a complex web of power, intrigue, religious strife, greed, and unprecedented audacity. On one side stood the English royal court, which transformed piracy into an art of statecraft. On the other, the vast but unwieldy Spanish Empire, whose viceroys and admirals raged in impotent fury, trying to catch a phantom. And somewhere in between, the whispers of conspiracies, the despair of victims, and the shadow of vengeance, which, as is known, tends to catch even the most elusive predators. For even the highest flight eventually ends in a fall, and the price of audacity can be far greater than the richest treasures. The triumph was deceptive. The wind that filled the sails of the Golden Hind and propelled Drake to the pinnacle of fame suddenly shifted. After bestowing upon him a knighthood, Elizabeth I, that cold, pragmatic queen, gave him no rest. The success against the Armada only whetted the crown's appetite, and now the dragon was back in the saddle. But his luck seemed to have remained somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, off the shores of the New World. The Lisbon expedition of 1589 was not merely a failure. It was a harbinger of his decline. Instead of a triumphant capture of the Portuguese capital, it was a disaster. Thousands dead, ships abandoned, and the unbearable stench of defeat that no court intrigue could dispel. The Queen, who had showered him with honors just yesterday, now regarded him with cold calculation, while his court rivals, always ready to stab him in the back like a pack of hungry jackals, sensed weakness. Drake, accustomed to absolute authority on his ship and in his expeditions, found himself caught in a web of political intrigues, where his audacity was no longer perceived as valor, but as arrogance. How did the accumulated sins affect him? Could he sleep soundly when the shadows of thousands of abducted souls, plundered cities, and executed rivals hovered over his bed? Was it the burden of conscience or simply the wear and tear of an aging body? But something broke in this man of iron. He became irritable. His once sharp mind dulled, and the intuition that had always guided him through the most hopeless situations now treacherously failed him. Each new expedition, conceived as another triumph, turned into bitter disappointment. His moment of glory had passed. The final throw of the dice, the 1595 expedition to the Caribbean, back to the very places where his bloody career had once begun. It was a desperate return to his roots, an attempt to reclaim lost glory. But the Spanish were ready. They had fortified their ports. Their fleets had become faster and deadlier. Drake, once an elusive phantom, now encountered a solid wall of resistance. The attempt to capture Las Palmas, a failure. The assault on Nombre de Dios, an inglorious retreat. There was no gold. There was no glory. There was only the oppressive atmosphere of defeat and despair. And amidst this chaos, aboard his Defiance, it caught him. Dysentery. An ironic, repulsive retribution. Not by the blade of a Spanish grandee, nor by a cannonball, but by the most primitive, filthy disease, born from the very conditions in which his bloody trade thrived. Death by dysentery, far from home, surrounded by disappointed faces and the smell of decaying tropics. It was not a heroic end, but a pathetic finale for a man whose life was the embodiment of ruthless force. His last thoughts? Perhaps feverish visions of riches that slipped through his grasp. Or perhaps the faces of those he betrayed, those he sold into slavery, those he deprived of life. Or did he simply feel a cold emptiness, realizing that all his conquests, all his piratical exploits, all his riches, were merely dust in the wind? On January 28, 1596, off the coast of Portobello, Sir Francis Drake breathed his last. His body, encased in a lead coffin, was committed to the bottomless abyss that had once been his dominion and now became his tomb. Without lavish ceremonies, without honors befitting a national hero. Just a body, cast into the deep, for the waves to wash away the last traces of a life that was both sordid and astonishing. As the Caribbean waters swallowed the last of the great buccaneers, a question lingered. What truly lay buried in that bottomless grave? Was it merely a body? Or something far greater? Something that continues to poison our understanding of history to this very day. This brings us to the most uncomfortable lesson Francis Drake's story offers. It's not merely a tale of bygone eras, of sails, gunpowder, and gold. It is a mirror reflecting our own contemporary reality, distorted only by its changing scenery. Consider, what was Drake? If we strip away the romanticized image and state propaganda, he was a man whose crimes, robbery, murder, slave trading, were not only forgiven but elevated to national valor, simply because they yielded profit and served the crown's interests. His actions were, in essence, state terrorism, cloaked in the noble guise of privateering and defending the Protestant faith. Now look around. Do we not see these very same mechanisms at work today? What do we call the heroes of our time? The architects of financial schemes that bankrupt entire nations? The strategists who plan economic wars leading to the impoverishment of millions? The business magnates whose empires are built on exploitation and hidden deals, often teetering on, or crossing, the line of legality, yet always masked by claims of innovation or efficiency. State piracy hasn't vanished. It has simply traded sailing ships for stock exchange terminals and boarding cutlasses for sanction packages. When entire nations face economic blockades, when their assets are frozen, and trade routes are cut off under the pretext of defending democracy or fighting tyranny, isn't that the very same tactic Drake employed, merely on a global scale and with far more devastating consequences? Sanctions are the modern equivalent of a raid on Cartagena, only instead of direct bullets, they unleash the invisible bullets of inflation, hunger, and social chaos. Corporations that swallow competitors using insider information or aggressive dumping are nothing less than the modern capture of the Cacafuego, but instead of silver ingots, they seize market shares and intellectual property. And all of this, just as with Drake, is legitimized by national interests, free trade, or geopolitical necessity. We, the spectators of this global spectacle, often become complicit when we applaud our victories in global markets, without considering the price paid by others. We admire effective leaders, unwilling to see their methods, which are, in essence, merely a high-tech version of piracy. Drake's primary, uncomfortable lesson isn't that he was a pirate or a hero. It's that these categories are interchangeable when power and profit dictate the rules. It's that human nature, greedy for power and wealth, merely changes its tools, but not its essence. And the question that should torment anyone who dares to look at this history without rose-tinted glasses is, How far have we truly come from the age of buccaneers, if we are still willing to justify plunder, violence, and betrayal as long as it's ours and beneficial? Or perhaps we've simply learned to call it by different names, so our consciences can sleep more.